Welcome to tonight's video on reference angles and how to use them to find the trigonometric value of any angle, and then we'll talk about the unit circle as well. So to find a reference angle, remember the rules apply the same as they did for degrees. If it's in the first quadrant, the reference angle is equal to the actual angle. In the second quadrant, the reference angle is equal to 180, which in radians is pi, minus the angle. In the third quadrant, the reference angle is equal to the angle minus pi. And in the fourth quadrant, the reference angle is equal to 2 pi minus the angle. So those rules apply just like they did for degrees. So in the first one, it's in the second quadrant. Right, second quadrant. So that's 5 pi over 6. So the rules for the reference angle, remember in the second quadrant, it's equal to pi minus 5 pi over 6. Well, that would give you pi over 6. There you go. All right, when it's bigger than 2 pi, then you want to find the coterminal angle. So 8 pi over 3 minus 2 pi gives you 2 pi over 3. So that means it's in the second quadrant. So it's 2 pi over 3. And the reference angle is right here. And remember, in the second quadrant, the reference angle is equal to pi minus the angle, which is 2 pi over 3. So the reference angle is equal to pi over 3. If it's negative, remember we add 2 pi. So that gives us negative pi over 6. Then we add 2 pi again. So that gives us 11 pi over 6, which goes to the fourth quadrant. It's 11 pi over 6. There's the reference angle. And remember, the reference angle in the fourth quadrant is 2 pi minus 11 pi over 6. So it gives you pi over 6. And then 15 pi over 4, remember, it's minus 2 pi, which gives you 7 pi over 4, which is also in the fourth quadrant. And remember, in the fourth quadrant, the reference angle is 2 pi minus the angle, which is, in this case, pi over 4. So that's how you find the reference angle. Now remember the chart that we used before, that pi over 3 is equal to 60 degrees. Pi over 4 is equal to 45 degrees. And pi over 6 is equal to 30 degrees. So there's our 30, 60, 90, and 45, 45, 90 ratios, because remember, 30, 60, 90. Remember, 30, opposite the 30 is 1, the 60 rad 3, the hypotenuse is 2. And in a 45, 45, 90, we have 1, 1, and rad 2. So those ratios hold true. So sine 3 pi over 4. 3 pi over 4 is in the second quadrant. So when you find the reference angle, remember that's pi minus 3 pi over 4. So the reference angle is pi over 4. which means it's a 45 degree, so it's 45, 45, 90. And remember, in the second quadrant, the sign is positive, so the sine pi over 4 is 1 over rad 2, which is rad 2 over 2. And in the second quadrant, because the sign is positive, the sine of 3 pi over 4 is going to stay rad 2 over 2. There you go. Cotangent negative pi over 3, well, negative pi over 3 plus 2 pi will give you 5 pi over 3, which is in the fourth quadrant. So in the fourth quadrant, it's here, which means the reference angle 2 pi minus pi over 3, or sorry, 5 pi over 3 gives you pi over 3. So that's the reference angle. Remember, pi over 3 is the same as 60, so it's rad 3 across from the 60, 1 and 2. Cotangent is x over y, so it's 1 over rad 3, which is rad 3 over 3. And since it's in the fourth quadrant, remember the cotangent is negative, because the tangent is negative. So the cotangent of negative pi over 3 is negative rad 3 over 3. Secant negative 17 pi over 4. Well, actually, we'll do the tangent first. Tangent 14 pi over 3. Well, remember, 14 pi over 3 minus 2 pi gives you 8 pi over 3. And that's still bigger than 2 pi, so we subtract again. And we get 2 pi over 3. That's in the second quadrant. The reference angle is equal to pi over 3. So our reference angle is pi over 3, which is 60 degrees. So it's rad 3, 1, 2. The tangent, remember, is y over x. So the tangent of pi over 3 is rad 3. And since it's in the second quadrant, the tangent of 14 pi over 3 is negative rad 3. Because remember, all students, or all star, S for sine, so since it's not sine, it's going to be negative. Negative 17 pi over 4 plus 2 pi is negative 9 pi over 4. We add another 2 pi is negative pi over 4. And then add another 2 pi is 7 pi over 4. And then fourth quadrant. So the reference angle here, when you find it, is 2 pi minus pi over 4, or sorry, minus 7 pi over 4, which is pi over 4. So that makes it a 45, 45, 90. So the secant, remember, the secant of pi over 4 is hypotenuse over adjacent, so it's rad 2. And since it's the fourth quadrant for negative 17 pi over 4, it would also be rad 2. All right, whenever you're finding the quadrantal angles, we want to use the point on the unit circle, because we can't draw triangles for the quadrantal angles. So look at the unit circle points for each quadrantal angle. Like, for example, this is 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2. And remember, the radius is 1. So this point here would be 1, 0. This point up here would be 0, 1. This point here would be -1, 0. And this point here would be 0, -1. So if I say find the trig values at 3 pi over 2, I'm going to use the point 0, -1. And remember, in the unit circle, the cosine is x, right? So the cosine is x, so it's 0. The sine, remember, is y, so that would be -1. The tangent, remember, is y over x, which is -1 over 0, which is undefined. The reciprocals, so the secant of 3 pi over 2, remember, is 1 over x. 1 over 0 is undefined. The cosecant of 3 pi over 2 is 1 over y, which is 1 over -1, which is -1. And the cotangent of 3 pi over 2, remember, is x over y, which is 0 over -1, which is 0. So that's the quadrantal angles. If you're talking about pi over 4 is halfway between pi over 2 and 0. So if we look at it in terms of the unit circle, halfway means that these two are going to be equal. So if you have x squared plus x squared equals 1 squared, 2x squared equals 1, x squared equals 1/2, and x equals plus or minus 1 square root of 1/2, and that is equal to 1 over rad 2. When you rationalize it, it gives you rad 2 over 2, which means your x and y coordinates are both rad 2 over 2, which means the cosine of pi over 4 is rad 2 over 2. The sine of pi over 4 is rad 2 over 2. The tangent, if y and x are the same, the tangent is 1. The secant, if you take the reciprocal of that, of 1 over that, you get rad 2. The cosecant, the reciprocal, is also rad 2. And the cotangent, or the reciprocal of the tangent, is 1. So finding the quadrantal angle trig functions, I'll do 0 and then I'll let you do the rest on your own. Remember, the point for 0 is 1, 0, so x and y. So the cosine of 0 is 1, because it's the x. The sine of 0 is 0. The tangent of 0, y over x, is 0. The secant of 0 is 1, because that's the reciprocal. The cosecant of 0, well, 1 over 0 is undefined. And the cotangent of 0, 1 over 0, is undefined. So that's how to find the values of the quadrantal angles. Now remember, we talked about all-star trig class, and that's when the sine, cosine, tangent are positive in what quadrants. So if they're not positive, they're going to be negative. So here it says if tangent theta is less than 0, meaning negative, and cosine theta is positive, name the quadrant which the angle lies. Well, the tangent is negative in the second and fourth. The cosine is positive in the first and fourth. So therefore, the angle lies in quadrant 4. because that's where it overlaps. For the next one, if the sine of theta is negative, meaning it has to be in the third or the fourth, and the cosine is negative, meaning it's in the second or third, that means the quadrant that the angle lies in is the third. Given the tangent of theta is negative 2/3 and the cosine is positive, well, the tangent is negative in the second and fourth. The cosine is positive first and fourth. So that means this angle is in the fourth quadrant. That's not necessarily what it's asking, but it's important because remember, tangent is y over x. So you can get the x coordinate and the y coordinate, but you got to know which one is negative. And if it's in the fourth quadrant, that means the y is negative. So to find the r value, you take the square root of x squared plus y squared. So 9 plus 4, so it's equal to rad 13. So remember, since this is not a unit circle, because the r is bigger than 1, remember cosine is x over r, so it's going to be 3 over rad 13, which is 3 rad 13 over 13, and the cosecant, which is r over y, which is rad 13 over negative 2. So the next one, the tangent is negative, and that happens in 2 and 4. And the cosine is negative, that happens in 2 and 3. So it's quadrant 2, which means if this is y over x, that in quadrant 2, the x is negative. So this would be negative 1 and 3. So that's your x and y, which means the r value is equal to negative 1 squared plus 3 squared. So it's equal to rad 10. So if I'm finding the sine, remember sine is y over r. So it's equal to 3 over rad 10, which is 3 rad 10 over 10. And the secant, which is r over x, so it's rad 10 over negative 1, which is negative rad 10. Now, labeling a point on the unit circle, remember the radius is 1, and so the ordered pair, it'll be the cosine and the sine. Because remember, cosine is x, sine is y. So remember, we did the quadrantal angles. This is 1 and 0. And this is 0 degrees and 0 radians. Then 30 degrees, pi over 6 in radians. 45 degrees, pi over 4 in radians. We'll get to the points in a second. 60 degrees, pi over 3 in radians. 90 degrees, pi over 2 in radians. And remember, the point was 0, 1. This is 120 degrees, 2 pi over 3. And then 135 degrees, 3 pi over 4. 150 degrees, 5 pi over 6 when you convert it. 180 degrees and pi, and remember it's negative 1, 0. 210 degrees, 7 pi over 6. 225, 5 pi over 4. 240, 4 pi over 3. 270 is 3 pi over 2. And this would be 0, negative 1. 300, which is 5 pi over 3. 315, which is 7 pi over 4. 330, which is 11 pi over 6. And back to 360. So now, as far as the other ones go, remember the pi over 4 angles we said were rad 2 over 2 and rad 2 over 2. And the only difference in the second quadrant is now the x is negative, but the y is still positive. And in the third quadrant, the pi over 4 angle, the x and y are both negative. And in the fourth quadrant, the x is positive and the y is negative. For a pi over 6 angle, remember pi over 6 is 30 degrees. Remember, so it's 1, rad 3, and 2. So remember the cosine is going to be rad 3 over 2. And the sine is 1/2. So then in the second quadrant, when it's pi over 6, it's just going to be negative rad 3 over 2 and 1/2. In the third quadrant, they're both negative. And in the fourth quadrant, the x is positive and the y is negative. And then for 60 degrees, it's just switched. Remember, 60 degrees, the cosine is 1/2, and the sine is rad 3 over 2. So in the second quadrant, the x is negative, the y is positive. In the third quadrant, they're both negative. And then in the fourth quadrant, the x is positive, the y is negative. All right, so that concludes on how to find the trig values using the unit circle and of any angle. And then next video, we'll talk about graphing.